Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for Issues and Answers, Public Education. I'm Fred Martino. Special thanks to our partner for this program, the League of Women Voters of Greater Las Cruces. In the hour ahead, we'll field questions from our studio audience for our guest, Jane Asche of the League of Women Voters of Greater Las Cruces. Jane co-chairs the League's Education Committee and will talk about their extensive education study. Andrea Fletcher is Associate Superintendent for Turnaround Initiatives at Las Cruces Public Schools. Patrick Sanchez is the President of the National Education Association Las Cruces. And Bill Souls is a teacher and a state senator. He'll be talking about possible legislation to address education in New Mexico. We should mention that New Mexico Education Secretary Designate Hannah Scandera was invited to join us for an interview or to join us for this program. While her communication director said she was not available, we hope to have her as a guest on another program in the new year. Full disclosure, before we begin, I am in the process of earning a doctorate in educational administration at New Mexico State University. Before we get to our audience questions, I have an introductory question for each of our panelists, and thank you to all of you for being with us, and happy holidays. Jane, to begin with you, you have a very impressive education study that is available on your website. It covers all sorts of different issues, which I think is very important in this program, in this dialogue that we're having. Often when we talk about education, and particularly what's called education reform, it simply focuses on tests, teachers, and schools, but it's so much bigger than that. And I particularly want to give you a chance in your study to talk about two very important issues: socioeconomics, which have changed enormously, not only in our community, but all around the country, and also the role of parents in student achievement and the importance of the influence at home in how students do in school.
Well, to let the audience know, our study was launched in 2011, and we spent 18 months studying in depth, particularly the local education system. We did in-depth interviews with teachers, students, parents, school board members, the superintendent of schools, the state education commissioner in our district, and charter school administrators. And we did in-depth literature reviews and research, and wrote papers on 4 areas: the New Mexico Common Core curriculum standards, the charter schools, standardized testing, and teacher performance. And then we did a number of book reviews that focused on education reform and early childhood education. Did unit meetings where we educated people in the public with PowerPoint presentations, fact sheets about all this information. But a couple of things that we found that were just extremely important as we engaged in this 18 months of study was that socioeconomic status has a profound effect on student achievement. It's the single factor or variable that accounts for the most variance in outcomes, a little over 30%, and many factors are a part of the outcomes, the successful outcomes for any student. In Doña Ana County, there's 39.2% of the children that are living in families in poverty. And here in the Las Cruces public school system, according to the 2012 Bureau of, the U.S. Bureau Census, there are 32% of the Las Cruces children, students between the age of 5 and 17, living in poverty. So this is extremely important to take into account as everybody is working together to help students with student success. But the important thing about all this is a lot of those factors that are a part of the environment of poverty are things that happen outside the schools. It's not things that the schools have much control over. And I can go into those with more detail later, but I just want to point out that some of the factors that are involved can really lead to neurological damage, to delayed cognitive development. So it's not just what the schools are doing. In fact, they're doing some pretty amazing things, in my opinion, after our study. But it is the whole community coming together and beginning to align resources and impact those situations and circumstances that hold these families down in poverty. One of the things that is heartening and encouraging and hopeful is that when you look at these children that are growing up in poverty and all the barriers that are in front of them, there is one factor that can make a huge difference in their success, and it's twice as predictive as their low SES circumstances, and that is parent involvement in education. It's key, it's crucial. And so all the ways that we can align resources in the community to begin to help parents have the skills and knowledge about how they become involved in their child's education, become their child's first teacher, those things can make all the difference in the world in outcomes for the students. So those are some really important things I think we should be focusing on. And I do want to say, before you move on to Andrea, that there's a number of initiatives going on in our community. There are many groups, nonprofit organizations, people from the business sector that are working on innovative initiatives that are beginning to move the needle to help some of these most at-risk children really begin to achieve. There's a couple things that can really help all the factors that surround a child and their circumstances related to poverty. One is and one of the groups that's working on these factors is the Okatia Institute for Social Justice. Another group is the Institute for Community Engagement that's working on a major collective impact initiative. So those are a couple important things.
And I'm sure as we continue, we're going to hear about more. This is incredibly important, and I'm glad that you were able to start our discussion by talking about those issues, because it's very, very much part of the dialogue here during this program. Andrea, you deal with at Las Cruces Public Schools in what's called the Turnaround Initiative. I gather that probably a lot of people watching this program, this will be the first chance they have to hear about this in depth. So tell us a little bit about this and what you're doing.
Well, thank you. I'm actually very excited to have this opportunity to share what we're doing with Turnaround. So we have 5 schools that began the turnaround process in the summer of 2012, 3 elementary schools and a middle school, and then we had a joint ungraded multi-age primary program that targets our most at-risk students and provides interventions for them in a multi-age setting. And so that was the beginning of the turnaround. And those principals who were selected for those schools went through a very intensive leadership training program, and then were provided intensive training and support throughout the year, both with University of Virginia and through the district. So it was successful enough at the end of last year that we've actually added 6 more schools this school year. So we have a total of 11 schools in the district who are undergoing the turnaround process. And people often ask, what is turnaround about? So I always want to start with what it's not. Turnaround is absolutely not a curriculum. It's not a set program. It is certainly not a prescription. I think our turnaround principals were desperately hoping that it was a prescription and there were just a checklist that you could put in place and that would be the answer. But it varies in every building, because what we're finding are the root causes for low student performance are different in every building, and we have to be mindful of what those root causes really are so that we're not just putting a Band-Aid on. So just to talk about some of the common elements of turnaround, I appreciate your comments about poverty in the schools. I think it can be a huge factor, but we are not ready to relinquish control of that to just say that our students who face poverty cannot be successful. So, so we feel very dedicated to the idea that our students can reach 85% proficiency. And it sounds like a very high number, especially facing the poverty that we do in this community, but there are schools across the country who are facing similar demographics and similar issues and are successful. So we believe it just means turning upside down some of the ways we think about education. We tend to do things the way we've always done them, and it's time to really think about the resources we have. We have limited resources, so using those very purposefully. If things are not working, for heaven's sakes, let's stop doing them.
And along those lines, of course, one of the big concerns about this is some of how teachers and schools are judged involves standardized tests. And there's a great feeling, not only in New Mexico, but around the nation, that there are too many tests, and the tests are too high stakes. In fact, as I'm sure you're aware, in Texas, 15 tests were once required for graduation. Now it's down to 5 as a result of the legislative action in the state of Texas. Patrick, I want to move to you and the concerns that you have about standardized testing and the use of testing in teacher evaluation.
Right. First of all, thank you for having this program, first of all. It's very timely, obviously. It's a topic that's in the news almost every day. There may be a misconception that, you know, as a union leader, that we're against testing. And that's, you know, I'd like to lay that to rest. We invented testing. And of course, the reason for testing, you know, there are several reasons for testing. What we are against is the proliferation of testing. It's really gotten out of hand. And we have to ask, why is this happening? I mean, who would want more testing? And I think the answer, you know, in my view, is that it's the publishing companies stand to gain a lot of money from this. And it's also driving curriculum. There's people selling us canned curriculums. We're talking about curriculum. And it's just wrong. My own daughter, as a parent, I have a daughter who's a junior at Mayfield High School. And she recently spoke at a forum where she said she was going to be taking this year 14 standardized tests. And I'm like, Jackie, you're going to be telling this to a lot of people. You better make sure of your facts. She gave the speech. The next day she came to me and said, Pop, I'm wrong. It's 15. So it's just the amount of tests. What's the data being used for? We're awash in data. And that data, we have enough data on file on every kid now that we can make curricular decisions about those kids and alter the way we teach, pinpoint what that child needs. We don't need all of these other tests.
Okay. Bill, you're a teacher as well as a state senator.
Yes.
Give us your sense on this and also legislation that you might propose to deal with some of these concerns.
I think at the legislative level, certainly many legislators feel there's too much testing going on and the misuse of the data, that the tests that were designed to assess the child's ability are now being used as a measure of how good the teacher was, which is a misuse of that test. It wasn't designed for that, and therefore you start getting very sketchy data that may not be appropriate for what it's currently being used for. At the legislative level, we are trying to get a handle on that. As you know, everything that we propose as legislation has to go through a very extensive committee process, floor votes. Then the governor has an opportunity to review and to veto things. Several pieces of legislation this last session that got through that were to trying to control some of the testing were vetoed by the governor. Much of the testing that's being pushed onto the schools right now is being done through the public education department through rule and not through legislation. I will be proposing that some legislation to control some of the testing and some of the misuse of testing, because our kids really are feeling like they're over-tested. Just this week in Oñate High School, the whole school was disrupted by the end of course exams that were being given, and the teacher had to have a different teacher give the test. It had to be given under very controlled regulations, which changes timing within the school and just disrupts the entire school, and you don't have a lot of education going on during that.
I'm sure we'll get to this, Bill, and perhaps from audience questions, but before we move on to that audience section, in addition to this feeling that there's over-testing and the effect on teachers and on schools, I'm wondering as well, another issue, is there displacement as well of other learning that could be taking place, especially writing, which is so incredibly important when you make it to the college level, being able to write proficiently?
Yes, I think so. And I see it, and my one view is not data, but I think the general feeling of teachers, at least at the high school level, and I think also down at middle school and elementary level, is that it does get in the way of actual learning. When I have students that have to be pulled out to do other tests, it's difficult for me as a classroom teacher to cover new content because I've got some students who are out and not getting the content. And so they either have to do it as a makeup, or I've got to wait for them with the other content my class is taking or needs to get. And I think that's a general feeling, and as we're doing more and more of the testing, it takes away from time that teachers can plan exciting, interesting lessons, and the students get a lesser value education for it, because education is much greater than just your score on a test. There's a much richer dynamic going on in the interaction between students and teachers, and a lot of that feels like it's getting lost in all of this push for higher test scores.
Thank you very much for that, and we'll hear more, I'm sure, as the hour continues. While we wait for our first audience question, and we do welcome our audience members to come to the microphone, be that first brave person asking the first question, some interesting information shared by the president of the Great Schools Partnership, Oliver Thomas, in a recent edition of USA Today. Thomas was writing about the heavily publicized international ranking, the Program for International Student Assessment. You may have heard about this. Much of the media coverage in the United States dealt with challenges for our country on this measure, with laments that we were falling behind. Some of those stories mentioned Finland, which does very well in this ranking. But Finland also has a very low child poverty rate. Here is what Oliver Thomas pointed out in USA Today. He said, here's one data point worth remembering. When you measure the test scores of American schools with a child poverty rate of less than 20%, our kids not only outperform the Finns, they outperform every nation in the world. Here's what he went on to say. 2 new studies on education and poverty were reported in Education Week in October. The first, from the Southern Education Foundation, reveals that nearly half of all U.S. public school students live in poverty. The second study, conducted by the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, reveals that poverty, not race, ethnicity, national origin, or where you attend school, is the best predictor of college attendance and completion. Some food for thought as we continue our discussion, and we welcome our first audience member.
Hello, you just answered my question. However, I do have another.
Good.
And brief, would you please talk about effective teacher evaluation? There are some good programs out there, and what do you feel is the best way to evaluate teachers?
Thoughts on that? Bill.
I'd be happy to start. Most teacher evaluation, if the evaluation is designed to assist the teacher in doing a better job teaching, which means it's collaborative with the person doing the evaluation, if it's working on how can I do things better, having another set of eyes in the classroom, helping understand the dynamic, makes for great evaluations. In New Mexico, the teacher evaluation system that we currently are trying to work under has that as a portion, but a large portion of it is based on student test scores, of which the classroom teacher has limited ability to affect, and sometimes very little, because they aren't even teaching the subject that's being tested. And so I think evaluations that are designed to improve teaching are very good. Evaluations that are designed to rate teachers, rank teachers, make decisions about promotion gets it the wrong message, and most people are very leery of.
And Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, the push in the state of New Mexico is to base 50%, half of a teacher evaluation on standardized test scores. Is that right?
That is correct. And one of the problems, obviously, we have with that is that the New Mexico PED, through the Secretary Designate, has said, well, we have to do that in order to get the waiver from No Child Left Behind with the new Race to the Top. So we ask Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, and he says clearly, no, 20% would be fine. He touted the plan in New York that uses 20%.
Okay.
So we asked the Secretary Designate, and perhaps if she is willing to come on your show, you can ask her that yourself.
Okay, thank you. Have another
Great
question?
question.
Well, on the subject of assessment, has much been done in New Mexico along the lines of what is referred to as authentic assessment? Is that being used much here at all? I realize that it doesn't give you the easy and fast numbers that the standardized tests do, but I think there has been some indication that this might be a different approach.
First, we may need a definition. Let's see if we can define authentic assessment, what that means.
Sometimes I've heard it characterized as like a portfolio assessment, where a student would show a demonstration of work over time through various methods. And in fact, we're trying to push for that now with graduation requirements being so set in stone now. We have probably 150 to 160 kids at each of our large high schools that have found out just this year. In fact, now over the Christmas break, they're compiling these numbers, and they're going to be told that they're not going to be able to graduate. We're pushing for an alternative demonstration of competency that shows a portfolio assessment.
Okay, very interesting. And we are going to have another audience question in just a moment. I want to get to as many audience questions as possible for the rest of our show, so I have asked folks to keep their questions short so that we can really spend time delving into the issues.
My question is, what could we do as a local school district to try to calm some of these fears and to bring some peace to some of our seniors in our high schools that are really scared to death that they're not going to graduate? What can we do as a local district, as a community, to try to advocate for these kiddos?
That's a big challenge and a big problem. Who wants to take it? Bill, we'll start with you. How about that?
Let them graduate.
That's why I'm at the state level. I don't have to
That's right.
deal with the local.
But you're also a teacher.
No,
so-
yes.
right, so-
I know each of the high schools are spending a lot of time calling students into the counseling office, looking at what the options are, what classes here at the mid-semester break. There's going to be a number of students, their classes are going to get adjusted so that they're able to try and meet those requirements. It's back to some of the testing. They've got alternative tests, retakes of the end of course exams, and so they're going to be doing lots of that. Now that also means, again, we pull them out of other classes in order to try and retake an exam that they already have. I believe that the local school board is looking at options of having a local assessment that does not go through the public education department that would indicate that a student has met the requirements for graduation. So an alternative to meeting the state level requirements.
Okay.
I'd like to have a chance to answer that as
Yeah.
well. One thing that, to answer the question, to allay the fears of parents, is to get parents involved. Let's take, for instance, band parents. Band parents were just told that marching band no longer counts as a PE credit, for instance. And You know, there is no fury like a band parent that has been told that their kid is not going to potentially graduate because, you know, they have switched rules in the middle of the game. I'm a band parent myself. And so I think if we get the community, and I'm seeing a movement grow of community members that are getting involved, making calls to the legislators, and to the governor and to the PED. And I've already seen some movement in that case.
So action in the home and outside the home
Absolutely.
as well. Okay, we have another question.
Hi, I'm a middle school teacher and have been for 23 years. I taught language arts or reading for 22 years. And I have asked my middle school students, what is the purpose of reading? And they say, to pass tests. And when I try to encourage them for fun, entertainment, life fulfillment, no, it's to pass tests. So considering we have a very high dropout rate in the state of New Mexico, and if students don't want to read, then they're not going to be proficient readers. What do we do to overcome that obstacle?
Andrea, let me ask you this. I mean, that is a powerful statement that talks about is student engagement being affected by what we're seeing. How do you deal with that in terms of your difficult job in trying to turn around schools to try to help improve performance?
So obviously, student engagement is a huge issue as we look at root causes in the turnaround schools. That has been a key area that we've identified. So we work very hard to make sure that teachers get feedback on how to produce engaging lessons and how to make connections with the curriculum across different subject areas so that students are having an engaging experience. Because you're absolutely right, if it's all about test scores, kids won't be engaged. We have to find a way to make it real for students. And we have to really focus on meaningful reading and writing that's connected to the joy of learning. So many of our schools are looking at trying to incorporate project-based learning into the curriculum so that we have students actually doing things that then they connect the reading and the writing to real actions in the real world.
Okay, great. Another question?
Yes, I just want to change the subject just a tiny bit. Recently, Secretary-designate Scandera overrode the decision of the Public Education Commission and allowed a for-profit online school to be established in Farmington, New Mexico. I actually have two questions here. Who should have the authority to make this kind of decision for public school students? And secondly, does the money for the for-profit school come out of the public school budget or from some other account in the public education department?
Bill, can you take
Thank
that
you.
for us? Do you know the answer?
I would be happy to, and it's an issue I have lots of information and very passionate about. To answer the second part first, yes, they are a public school. They are funded by public school dollars at the same rate as public school students in other schools. Actually, most charter schools get funded at slightly higher rates than the regular public schools do because of their small size adjustment that comes through the formula. And so they are public schools, those are public dollars. There is lots of discussion, shall I say, among legislators as to how do we clarify the law to make sure that charter schools are public schools and are not for-profit schools. Because some of the money that is being spent for the public school education is going to shareholders for those for-profit companies. The first part of the question dealt with the Secretary-designate overriding the PEC, the Public Commission on Education, Public Education Commission. Get the acronyms get twisted around sometimes. It was set up specifically to look at the rules dealing with charter schools, and I think they very carefully vetted and said this did not meet the requirements for charter schools, does not meet the state laws dealing with charter schools that say specifically they cannot be for profit, and denied it. but there's also a provision that the Secretary of Education can overrule the Public Education Commission, and that's what happened.
Okay. Anything that in terms of legislative action that would affect change in that area?
There were some bills this last time of which I don't recall whether they got all the way to the governor or not, but that were proposed to try and get control of that. And there will be again, because I think there's a very strong feeling among many legislators that public education dollars are for public schools and not for profit.
Okay. We have another question.
In terms of trying to get students engaged in their own educational process through high schools and programs such as student government, is there a benefit to having students participate in the civic process with senators and other elected officials in regards to the band issue and having their voices heard, being a part of that process, having the education board listen to them and how important this is, involving the governor and get them involved in that to encourage and also to educate them on civic processes?
I'd like to take a shot at that question. As a social studies teacher, one of the problems that I have with all of these new initiatives is that there's a focus on literacy and numeracy, and of course those are important areas. But we have seen an erosion of the social studies, and that's exactly what the question is asking. We're losing our ability to, be involved in civil discourse. We're losing. If you look at the national level, for instance, that's a great example. People no longer talk to each other. Sure, they're at polar ends of issues, but surely they can come together. And that's what we need to teach our kids, and that's what the social studies are all about. History, psychology, sociology, and we're losing those because of the current focus on literacy and numeracy.
I'd also like to comment, one of the things that I really enjoy doing out at Oñate is I go to the government classes and sit and talk in a nonpartisan way, but how bills are passed, on what is the process within committees, how does it get to the floor, the whole process of how legislation happens. And the students are really engaged because they're seeing someone they know in their school that they feel they can talk to. And I've encouraged, last year at the legislative session, I had a couple of students come and shadow me for a few days. They were my guests up there. We Skyped into the school live a couple of days while I was there. And I think that's an important way of getting them engaged, that this really does affect their lives. It's not things that people are doing to them from other places, but it's part of their lives. And I'm available whenever I can be to any other schools if anyone would like me to come talk to government classes or things. I love doing that, and I think that's the kind of education that gets lost when we chase test scores.
Absolutely.
Okay. Another question.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'd just like to say that I would like to acknowledge the lady's last statement, and I think if for people that are passionate about education, George S. Counts, he wrote extensively about this, about the disengagement of public education and students in the public itself and government. But it seems that for years and years and years, academia and all kinds of studies have been made that sort of are different, that a different direction from actual public policy and education. And so when is this actual reform going to happen? What is it going to take? The schools are already fracturing, they're falling apart. So what is it that we can do to really reach out to the students and have them come up and say, if nobody else can do it, somebody's got to do it. And so when is that change going to happen, and how can we sort of allow that to happen and as a catalyst?
Jane, I think you addressed this at the beginning of the program, that one of the difficult things about this issue is while most of the dialogue, particularly in the commercial media, is dealing simply with teachers and with schools, this is about our entire community, and it's about, most importantly, as you said, parents getting involved, not only getting their kids to be engaged in school, but being involved in the civics aspect of this, contacting legislators, talking about this issue.
Right, right. It's just it's extremely important that there be a level of collaboration across all the sectors of the civic community, businesses, parents, teachers, nonprofit organizations, just every sector in the government sector, working together to see that there is more opportunity for dialogue, input, helping the student, or rather the schools, know what teachers are needing. And speaking about schools knowing what parents are needing, the public schools here are doing a terrific job with some parent involvement training that they're doing. Nonprofits are doing a terrific job as well. If we look at poverty, as I think you were when you quoted the statistics about the United States, like 50% of the students living in poverty, that's where we're looking at poverty from the standpoint of those who live at least below 200% of the poverty line. Our numbers would be up to 60–70% here in the Las Cruces School District. So people have to come together to align resources to help raise to scale the impact, to help all parents that need to learn how to be their children's first teacher and need to be involved in the learning process. We can't just rely on the schools, and we can't just rely on nonprofit organizations. It takes everybody in the entire community beginning to work towards some agreed upon common goals. And I think that's tremendously important. That's a process that's known as collective impact. And until that happens, we probably won't be able to reach all of the students and get all of the parents involved in the process.
Okay. Another question.
We've been speaking tonight about the very great impact that poverty has on these students. And I'm thinking this may also have an impact on the teachers who are working with those students. Mm-hmm. What kinds of resources are being offered to the teachers who are now dealing with this greater awareness and new teachers coming into the field?
That is such a great question, and you know, it also gets to this understanding of the issue, and it may relate to volunteering in the schools. One of the things that I will never forget as long as I live, I was in a previous city in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I had the opportunity to volunteer to go to the local public schools and to read to students and to see young people who sometimes weren't able to have attention in class because they didn't get much sleep the previous night because there was all sorts of things going on in their home to keep them awake. This is just one example that you learn in terms of volunteering in the schools and that teachers deal with every day. Andrea, give us a sense in terms of that question, what kind of resources we're also giving beyond instruction for teachers to deal with the effects of these kinds of problems that are happening in our community.
So I kind of want to revisit the parent involvement piece, because I think when we really create strong partnerships between parents and the school, that does take some of the burden off of the teachers, because in some ways we're asking teachers to be all things to all people, and that's very difficult. So you spoke about the initiative we have in Las Cruces Public Schools, the Institute for Parent Engagement, and it is coming at parent involvement from a very different perspective. So in the past, and not to denigrate the things that parents do, like coming to fundraising and coming to parenting events, reading with kids, those are all incredibly important. But we're really looking at this new program is empowering parents to become part of the educational process. So understanding how the system works. What is a grade point average? What courses would my kids have to take to end up in college? What steps do I have to take as a parent? What is the impact of not sleeping? So really creating partnerships, empowering them to ask schools the questions. How is my child doing, and what do I need to do to support that? So it's a totally different mentality. We had just recently a graduation with our first 5 turnaround schools, and we had hundreds of parents there who were from all walks of life, and it was the proudest moment. Many of those parents said they had their entire family there watching, and they said this was the first time someone in their family had walked across the stage to graduate. So it was very powerful, and I think
Wonderful
that
story.
creates a different dynamic in the schools.
I'd like to comment briefly on that because one of the things that happens for low SES parents, they often have the perception that they can't make a difference, and they're very uncomfortable about approaching the school, and they are not sure how to communicate with the teacher. And when these kinds of programs make them comfortable, feel welcome, that it is okay to come and teach them positive ways to communicate with the teachers, it makes all the difference in the success of the child.
Okay, Patrick, you want to add on this?
Well, when we talk about resources, we need to talk about the elephant in the room also. Resources sometimes means money. And as you know, since 2008, New Mexico ranks last for funding its public schools. We've taken the deepest cuts. So I look at resources. Let's say you have a class in an elementary school of 30 kids. We all know that the teacher is the greatest in-school factor in student achievement. So what if you could hire 2 teachers, cut the class in half, and have 15 students? Will the student get more individualized attention from a qualified expert? Yes. So we do have to look at the funding issue.
Okay. Another question.
What long-term effects do you think standardized testing will have on our education system and our students?
Okay. Who wants to take that first?
Go ahead.
I'd be happy to give a kind of a very short answer and it's similar to what I had said earlier. Standardized tests, and another lady had talked about who's the English teacher, it takes the joy out of learning. And if we take the joy out of learning, students aren't going to pursue learning as adults. And I think we are lesser as a society if we do that. And I think that's the biggest long-term impact that it has, is we become a society of test takers instead of having a rich, dynamic institution that perpetuates our society as we'd like it to be.
Yeah.
And I think, Fred, if sometimes we have the picture, since it was a high school person that asked the question, you know, we focus on the high school. What about kindergartners who are now, you know, undergoing the barrage of testing?
Now, you just said something very important. Kindergartners. There are
Absolutely.
I know that there are people watching this show right now. This is the first time that they have heard this, that there are kids in kindergarten are taking standardized tests.
Absolutely. On the computer, some of them, and you know, do they know how to work a mouse yet on a computer?
Now,
Keyboard.
And that was your daughter, by the way.
Yes,
right?
it was.
Okay. Who asked the question?
And
Let's get
I
that out there.
don't
Full
know the answer to
disclosure.
her question. We didn't set it up.
You didn't set it up. Full disclosure on that. But she asked the question in terms of students. I mean, how will this have a long-term effect on students? I want to ask you first, Patrick, your thoughts on how this is having a long-term effect on teachers and the teaching profession. And here's where I'm asking that question. As I think about my life and how my life has been profoundly affected by teachers, I thought about this when I thought about doing this program. One of the things I thought about when I thought about why was this so profound was the fact that I had incredible diversity in the types of teachers that influenced my life. I had teachers who were really hard on me sometimes. Thank goodness they were. I had teachers who had a very soft touch, and sometimes, in certain cases, that was the best thing. That was the right thing to do. It wasn't standardized.
And Fred, that's the most disheartening part of all of this so-called reform effort. My colleagues, the people I choose to surround myself with, are the best teachers in the district. And they're coming to me, and I see their faces, and they are truly demoralized. And that obviously has an effect on the kids. I've had 4 kids that I've put through the system. Jackie's my last now. And the experiences that my older kids had in our great public schools are so vastly different than the experience that my youngest. I mean, they've taken project-based learning away. It's all teach to the test because, you know, teachers are trying to show that, you know, we want test scores because the public looks at the school grading and test scores as an indicator of success. And it's wringing the fun out of learning.
Andrea.
So I'd just like to comment on the JUMP program, the Joint Ungraded Multi-Age Primary. So this is a program for kinder through 2nd grade, our most at-risk students. And so certainly they are taking these standardized tests, the discovery test. And we had kids come in who we had no proficient students in that group. And by the end of 1 year, they were 82% proficient. But I have to tell you what they were doing. So you go into these classrooms and these students are playing with Legos. They are using the Lego to build a story. So they hear a story, they think about what would be the next step in the story, they build it, and then they're able to write about it. So there's certainly innovation. I think there's a misconception that just because there is standardized testing, there is not fun and innovation going on in classrooms is not wholly true. I mean, that is something we're really looking at in turnaround. How do we create programs that are engaging and keep kids from falling off the map?
Okay, we have another question.
I'm impressed that most of the talk about numeracy and literacy addresses developing formal capabilities to compute and to read. There's a total loss of cultural literacy with teacher selection of literature, snippets, and smorgasbords. There's no coherence in learning for discourse among students from one class at the same grade level to another. How do we restore cultural literacy and coherence to the curriculum?
Okay, important question. Who wants to take it?
So that is one of the areas that we're talking about in the turnaround schools. So when you look at literacy and numeracy, it has to be in context, and we are very mindful of being careful about the testing, because the truth is, when you give someone a number goal for where they want a student to be, it is easy to get focused on the testing, and you have to keep coming back to the common sense about it, that there is a student behind this, and you have to be able to look at all those pieces of information. And remember, you still want a student who is a strong critical thinker, who can think for themselves and read for information and think about how to respond to real life situations.
You mentioned such an important issue, critical thinking skills, which like writing, which I mentioned earlier, is so important when you make it to college. He addressed cultural literacy, and I would certainly say part of that is in high school, learning throughout high school, the great literature of our time. I mean, when I was in high school, that was English class in high school. It was literature all the way through, and writing about the literature. So you develop the critical thinking skills and the writing skills. Bill, is this being displaced somewhat?
I think it is a little bit, and I was actually going to address it. I was a math teacher, and as a math teacher, we often teach to answer a question, to solve a problem, get an answer at the end. And I was very fortunate and developed and started a program teaching statistics, because statistics is using math to answer real life questions. It's the math we see every day. And that gets a bit more, I think, to more the cultural part of using mathematics rather than just solving a problem, getting a right answer that's on a standardized test. The right answer in statistics isn't getting the number at the end, it's what does that mean in context with what the problem was.
And boy, would I have liked it had I had statistics in high school, because I had to take it at the undergrad level and then at the grad level and struggled with it.
Much more practical kind of real life math in statistics than there is in doing quadratic equations in an Algebra 2 class.
Yeah, for sure. Another question. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to ask the panel what makes them optimistic about the future and what they think Las Cruces public school systems are doing right.
That's a great question. I'll start off. I think the recent movement that we've seen with community members coming together to assert and press for more local control of our schools so that we can assert our own cultural literacy, recognize our culture here in our area. We don't need people, you know, I don't want to sound the way this is going to sound, but we don't need people coming from other places to tell us what's important in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a very unique part of the world. And we don't want to lose that uniqueness because that's what makes us special. It really does.
What I think, you know, what gives me great hope is I get to work with some amazing students every single day. And they are bright, they're engaged, they're sharp, and given an opportunity, they do amazing things. That gives me great hope. I think Las Cruces schools, for many of our students, are a tremendous school district that exceeds expectations.
Yes.
We've got to do a better job in dealing with the students from poverty, in dealing with students who are second language learners, and the students that are not able to engage in all of the civic things that schools help promote. And I think that's the one place we need to do more with.
Yeah, but when the students are engaged and when the parents are engaged, it's unbelievable. We had a young man on this very stage just a few weeks ago who's a senior at New Mexico State University who came to this country at the age of 14, went to Las Cruces High School, and learned to speak English in addition to graduating from high school. He did not speak English when he came here. And he learned that in Las Cruces. So just incredibly important and something to celebrate, getting to the optimism question from our student. Another question?
Yes, just really quick. In our county, in our community, there's of course a lot of poverty and a lot of challenges. And so as a result, there's a teen pregnancy and some dropouts and a low high school graduation rate. But what if we pumped, and again, this is a funding issue, but what if we pumped money into the early part of the continuum, pre-K, and all of the early childhood development area so that we knew that the kids going into kindergarten were prepared? So just your thoughts on pumping more money into in the beginning part of the continuum so that we're not putting money at the end addressing a problem. Your thoughts?
Who wants to take that?
Totally support early childhood education. I think we always see that when kids are familiar with the school process and they come with knowledge about school and feeling good about school, by the time they get to kindergarten, we certainly see them just absolutely take off. So I think it's always valuable. The earlier the intervention, the better.
Yeah, and the question relates to civics again because in San Antonio, the mayor there, Julian Castro, talked about this in his speech at the Democratic National Convention. They actually have a portion of their taxes go toward early childhood education in the city of San Antonio. Question?
Yes. In New Mexico, you've been talking about meeting standards and so on, but we also have a rich culture and a rich language environment that we have here. We have kids that speak Spanish and they come to school, and instead of being developed and becoming bilingual, we take away that Spanish that they need to be successful in their life. So why can't we make it a goal for all kids in this area to become bilingual, just like they are in Europe? Bilingual, biliterate, especially in such a rich state where even the name of the city is Las Cruces, you know, so what do you feel about dual language programs?
How do you deal with that, Andrea?
So we do have dual language programs in our schools, and we're currently working with the Gomez and Gomez model of dual language instruction. It's an enrichment program, so our kids are really getting instruction in two language. We always face difficulty with having enough staff to hire. So there's typically a shortage of bilingually certified teachers, but it is an area that we always want to pursue.
Okay. Patrick, you talked about resources earlier. She mentioned staffing, and of course supply and demand when you're dealing with this is very difficult, and I would imagine there's incredible demand for bilingual teachers. Give us a sense of this and the challenge that public schools are facing.
Well, you said it right there. We do have a challenge filling these positions, and I'm very glad though the governor is going to float a bill to up the salary of beginning teachers, for instance, by 10%. I think is the I think it's a gimmick, but she does recognize that in order to attract and retain teachers, we need to up the pay. Now it's interesting, as I talk to teachers, this is really last on their list. I mean, everybody that teaches would accept a raise, don't get me wrong, but that's not really what they're after. What they're after is the time and the freedom to assert their professionalism. These are credentialed people, and they want the autonomy to exercise their expertise in the classroom and then be judged on their merits. And we don't need tests to do that. And of course, we need more resources.
Okay. Bill, your thoughts?
Certainly resources are a bunch of the problem with this. I used to work in the advisement center in the College of Education, and our bilingual teachers were in very high demand, and many of them that we prepare in this area, and they're being hired in Texas, in Arizona, in North Carolina, in California, for substantially higher starting salaries than we're able to offer in New Mexico. And so it's not that there aren't a lot of teachers being prepared. We don't pay high enough salaries in New Mexico to keep and retain the best and the brightest of those teachers. And we have some who love New Mexico and have cultural ties here and are going to stay. We lose a lot of those to other states because of the funding precisely. And we need to increase the funding in education. Teachers need to be paid more. We need more resources. We need more teachers so that teachers have enough time to plan. I mean, there's a number of funding issues that we as a legislature need to start dealing with because it has slipped over the last 20 years.
Okay, well, the legislative session is coming up. Good luck during that session. We'll be reporting on it.
I hope luck doesn't have anything to do with it, but I take good luck.
We'll be reporting on it at KRWG. Thank you so much to our panel. It has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm sure we'll do another one, hopefully talking about some of the success at the session. Thank you very much. Thank you at home as well. Stay with us on krwg.org, where you can also become a member. In-depth journalism is only possible with your support. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a great week.